These are some of the current recommended service intervals by brand. Seiko 3 years, Tissot 4 to 5 years, Nomos 5 years, Patek Philippe 5 years, Omega 5 to 8 years, Rolex 10 years. How to know if your mechanical watch needs a service? Let's find out in this video. Alright, before we continue, I wanted to share the results of a related poll we ran on our Instagram account. So 5 questions. The first question was, do you follow recommended service intervals? By the brand of your watch, of course. 22% voted yes. That leaves 78% that voted no. Then true or false, I only send in my watch for service when something seems wrong with it. 75% voted true. Then do you take cost of servicing a watch into account before buying it? 37% voted yes. Next question, I generally have a watch serviced around the 5-year mark, so with 5 years being the industry average. 35% voted yes. And then the last question, perhaps my last service experience was great. 58% voted true. So that's not a great mark there. Anyway, thought to share these. We'll get back to these results as we go along in the video. Now, before we continue, the strategy to follow when it comes to servicing your watch efficiently and effectively is quite different when comparing a new watch. So a one that you buy, you are the first buyer, the first owner, and then on the other hand, a pre-loved watch, so where you are not the first buyer. With that in mind, this video is cut up essentially in 2 parts. One part covering the new watch adventure, and then the second part which covers the vintage or second-hand route instead. Small disclaimer, I am not a professional watchmaker. I will cover general concepts in this video. In case of doubt, of course, always consult your local watchmaker or reach out to the brand whose watch you own. So here is what luxury brands tend to include in the definition of a full service, and I'm quoting Gégère Lecoultre here. So a complete service to them includes the following operations: a complete dismantling of the entire watch, polishing and cleaning of the case, including bracelet if there is one, and then cleaning, reassembling, oiling, adjusting of movement, replacement of used components, fitting the dial then of course afterwards, hands-on movement and reassembly, and then final controls. Now, if you want any of the above not to be done when you send your watch in for a service, for example, polishing of the case, make sure to explicitly mention that. So, without further delay, let's jump into the new watch adventure. An essential test to do to make sure you do not postpone something which shouldn't be postponed is the simple time test. So does your watch keep the time within specifications? So not all watches are equally accurate, of course, but your watch will have a certain accuracy rating, for example, plus minus 5 seconds a day. Do not measure that just in the course of one day, so measure a couple of days in a row or even weeks if you want to be very thorough, and then average that out. You have apps for the iPhones or for whatever smartphones that you may have. You can also track that with a simple notebook and a pencil if you must. Now, if it's deviating from the range, as I mentioned, or basically not tracking time correctly anymore, then I would urge you that it is time to have it serviced. Let me correct myself there, it's perhaps not the time to have it serviced, but at the very least, that is a good indicator that you should stop by your local AD or watchmaker. So sometimes the watch is not running along reliably anymore purely because it got magnetized, which is very easy in today's world. So simply demagnetizing your watch would then essentially fix that, so it doesn't require a full servicing of the watch. Now, if your watch does more than just show the time, you need to of course expand this thinking to the other complications it has. So perhaps it has a chronograph, and while the watch is keeping time correctly, the chronograph is acting a bit strange or the pushers feel a bit different from the usual. If that is the case, then again, do not postpone that visit to your watchmaker. Either just let them have a look at it. Now, then a special mention I think should be there for watches with water resistance. So in those cases, and specifically if you are intending to take your watch near water or in water, then additional care is absolutely recommended. So water resistance relies heavily on seals, gaskets, for example, which will become less effective over time. That's just a fact, as they dry up and lose their necessary elasticity to keep everything nice and sealed. So also the threading even of the screw down crown that can actually be worn out and potentially is then another source of where a leak can happen. What about vintage watches? Well, if you buy a vintage watch, make sure you know its full service history. I think that's the key point here. So when in doubt, add in a cost of a full service before you buy the watch. Assume that whatever the watch is selling for, you still need to pay a full service after you get it. Also with a vintage watch, perhaps different from with a new watch, you may actually want to look for a watchmaker specializing in vintage watch restoration. Coming back to the point that I just mentioned here about the first confirmed service, so try and stick to the recommended service intervals with the vintage watches. Grinding down a vintage movement is way more costly to fix or to service afterwards than grinding down a modern movement for which parts are readily available. A lot of variables also will impact how often you should service your watch. This really can't be understated. Everybody is different and everybody wears their watches differently. Do you wear your watch daily or do you rarely wear it? You know, if you just keep a mechanical watch in a drawer all year long, that's actually more of a reason to have it serviced afterwards if you take it out again than if you would have worn that watch regularly, which keeps the parts lubricated and the lubricants moving. Now, if you keep your watches off the wrist all year long, perhaps you have too many or you're collecting them and storing them for a while, do yourself a favor and wind them at least once a month. It'll go a long way in keeping that watch movement nice and healthy. Now for this video, just for clarity here, I skipped all the common sense signs that you should service your watch. So if you see any moisture in your case, for example, of course, have that checked out immediately. If you have cracked your crystal, of course, have that checked out immediately. You know, people sometimes postpone a service after they had a minor crack in the crystal. I would absolutely advise against that. Small particles may find their way into the movement, causing all sorts of headaches down the line. Thank you very much for watching, and if this was useful to you, please let me know in the comments. If you have any other tips to share, please, of course, also drop them in the comments below.